Hey everybody. So today you are going to learn about natural selection. Oops. Okay, so natural selection is the mechanism that drives evolution. So for some definitions to write down, evolution is the change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. And evolution is a theory, and theories in science have a different meaning than theories that people just kind of use the word, like in news or something. So a theory in science is a well-substantiated explanation based on laws, observations, and facts. So it's not just like a hypothesis. It has not been disproven, and it is based on facts. Natural selection is the mechanism, right, that drives evolution. And so organisms have adaptations, and those adaptations come from genetic variation. And they're suited for a particular environment that allows them to reproduce and pass those adaptations on to their offspring more often. So Charles Darwin, which is right here, he is the one who is credited with the theory of natural selection, and you need to have certain conditions for natural selection to happen. Okay, so there needs to be competition for limited resources. Some organisms then are going to have a better chance of survival, and they're going to have a better chance of passing on their genes to their offspring. So competition is when organisms fight for limited resources, and that could be food, water, mates, habitat, light, and differences in their phenotype, which are the adaptations, are going to lead to differential survival and differential reproduction. So the ones that are adapted for the environment better are going to reproduce and send have their offspring with their genes. So evolutionary fitness is the ability to produce fertile offspring. So fertile means that they can reproduce. So for example, a horse and a donkey create a mule, right? But that mule is sterile, and so it can't reproduce. So those two are different. That is not fertile offspring. Fertile offspring can reproduce. Reproductive success just means that it's the number of offspring produced. And then heritability is the ability for those phenotypes that give the advantage to be passed on. So selection can cause traits of individuals with more reproductive success to have more offspring, and then those traits, those phenotypes, become more common in the population. And so here are some cute little sea turtles, right? And they have to make their way to the ocean before they get taken by a bird or something. And so, them being able to move fast would be an adaptation. So ecosystem, down there, ecosystem stability determines the rate of evolution. So biotic, remember, means living, and abiotic means non-living, like water or minerals. And those environments change over time. And so basically, if the environment is unstable, then organisms are going to have to evolve quicker. And if the environment is stable, then evolution is slower. So this is an example over here. So here you have your habitat now for both things. Here's a stable environment, right? Not much it's not going to require change. However, if you have a volcanic eruption, and let's say this is a pocket mouse that's dark colored, right? And then the habitat changes to be a dark colored habitat, then they're going to have to evolve quick, or else they're going to get eaten by predators. So another example of this is the peppered moth. So the peppered moth is, right, these are two different variations, and after the Industrial Revolution, right, with all the coal and soot, the trees became dark. And so the white peppered moths were picked off by birds, and the dark peppered moths survived and reproduced and passed on those dark genes to their offspring. And so they passed on the dark phenotype to their offspring, which became more common. Then, after the Clean Air Act came around, trees became lighter because there wasn't, they were controlling the soot and the pollution, and the trees became lighter, and so the lighter peppered moths have become more common. So there's some results of natural selection, and there's three possible outcomes. So the first one is called directional selection, and that's caused by the pressure that shifts the population to one extreme. So for example, the peppered moths. So if the trees are darker, then that extreme phenotype of the darker peppered moth is going to become more common. Stabilizing selection is where the middle is favored, the middle phenotype, and the two the two extreme phenotypes are selected against. An example of that is birth weight, right? If you're too small, if your baby is too small of a birth weight, it has a lower chance of survival. And if the baby is too high of a birth weight, then it actually does as well. And disruptive selection is interesting, and that's where the two extremes are favored and the one in the middle is not. And an example of that is this rock pocket mice. So you have two different habitats. You've got volcanic rock and you've got sand-colored rock. And so the two extremes, the light and the dark, are the ones that are favored, and anything that's in between is going to show up on both of those habitats, and so it's going to be picked off by birds. So the two extremes become more and more common because they're passing down those genes that give you those traits. So here is another example, just a visual. So here in time one, right, these arrows show selection pressure. For example, these are going to be eaten more, not pass their genes on, and so eventually, the ones that are favored are the one side of this dark color. It could have gone the other way, so where the light are. Here is stabilizing, where there's more selection pressure on the extremes, and then the middle becomes more and more common, and then disruptive, where the middle is selected against, and the two extremes are selected for, like the pocket mice, and then you end up getting speciation and a new species. So sexual selection is where the selection favors secondary sexual characteristics. For example, male and female birds are an easy one. So here, male birds have these beautiful feathers, if you think of like a peacock, right? And so that actually is going to attract the mate. And so the bigger the feathers, the more mates it's going to get. And that's non-random mating. And so the one with the best song or the best feathers is going to get more offspring and pass those traits down. And that actually leads to what's called sexual dimorphism. So di means two, morph means shape, and that's really what causes the difference between males and females looking different in a species. So antibiotic resistance is an example of this. And so here you have your bacteria, right? And you take some antibiotics, and there are bound to be some resistant bacteria. So over time, the weak non-resistant ones are going to die, and those resistant ones are going to be left, and they're going to reproduce and pass on their genes to their offspring, and eventually you have a population of resistant bacteria, which is why it's so important to keep taking your antibiotics for the set amount of time and not just when you feel better, because when you feel better, it's down to this, right? There's not very many bacteria, but you've still got those resistant ones. So make sure you take your antibiotics for the full amount of time, and that decreases the resistant bacteria. So artificial selection, these cute little puppies here, is where humans are selecting the traits in animals or plants that they want to happen, to exhibit. So, for example, growing crops that have bigger and bigger vegetables. So they're gonna take those crops that have the big vegetables, and they're going to breed them with other crops that have big vegetables until the fruit and the vegetables get bigger and bigger and bigger. Dog breeds, right? Dogs are all one species, and they look very different because they've been bred for, spots, or they've been bred for the hounds with the big noses and the smelling abilities. And this can lead to either more genetic diversity or less genetic diversity. And that's it. So hopefully you learned something about natural selection.